The grandfather's trembling hand tightened around the aged pocket watch, its ticking an eerie reminder of time slipping away. "Listen carefully," he whispered to his grandson. But as his final words left his lips, a chilling truth unraveled, changing everything forever. The leather-bound journal sat on the polished oak desk, its corners frayed with time. A relic of decades past, its pages bore the weight of every hard-earned lesson, every sleepless night, every triumph and regret. Nicholas Whitmore, a man whose name echoed through boardrooms and financial empires, stared at it with a gaze heavy with contemplation. He had built an empire from the ground up, transforming his father's failing textile business into a multinational conglomerate. But at what cost? The dim glow of the fireplace flickered against the room's mahogany walls, casting elongated shadows that danced across the antique furniture. The storm outside howled like a restless ghost, rattling the grand windows of his estate, yet Nicholas remained unmoved. The storm within him was far worse. He was 60 now, 60 years of calculated risks, relentless ambition, and an unforgiving pursuit of success. Yet success had not come without sacrifice. His fingers brushed against the journal's worn spine, tracing the initials embossed in gold. N.W. The same initials that once adorned the side of a modest storefront, back when his dreams had been simple, back when his wife still loved him, and back when his son still called him Dad without the weight of resentment. He had written in this journal religiously, each page a ledger not of profits and losses, but of wisdom. Wisdom paid for in sleepless nights and estranged relationships. And now, it was time to pass it on. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. He already knew who it was before the door creaked open. His grandson, Daniel, stood at the threshold, a hesitant curiosity in his young eyes. 18 and brimming with reckless energy, Daniel was everything Nicholas once was. Driven, eager, yet painfully naive. "Grandpa?" Daniel's voice carried both curiosity and uncertainty. He had spent summers here as a child, running through these halls, oblivious to the weight that rested on the man who built them. But things were different now. This visit wasn't about childhood nostalgia, it was about something far more pressing. Nicholas motioned toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Daniel obeyed, his gaze flitting between his grandfather and the journal on the desk. He had grown accustomed to seeing Nicholas in a position of power, but tonight the old man looked weary. Not weak, not broken, but carrying an exhaustion deeper than the lines etched across his face. "You're leaving for college soon," Nicholas said, his voice even, controlled. "And before you step into the world, I need to give you something." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Money." A bitter chuckle escaped Nicholas. Something far more valuable. He slid the journal toward Daniel, who hesitated before picking it up. The pages smelled of aged paper and ink, of a lifetime spent conquering and losing in equal measure. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice uncertain. Nicholas leaned forward, eyes dark with unspoken memories. "The price of everything I've built, and everything I lost along the way." The leather-bound journal sat on the polished oak desk, its corners frayed with time. A relic of decades past, its pages bore the weight of every hard-earned lesson, every sleepless night, every triumph and regret. Nicholas Whitmore, a man whose name echoed through boardrooms and financial empires, stared at it with a gaze heavy with contemplation. He had built an empire from the ground up, transforming his father's failing textile business into a multinational conglomerate. But at what cost? The dim glow of the fireplace flickered against the room's mahogany walls, casting elongated shadows that danced across the antique furniture. The storm outside howled like a restless ghost, rattling the grand windows of his estate, yet Nicholas remained unmoved. The storm within him was far worse. He was 60 now, 60 years of calculated risks, relentless ambition, and an unforgiving pursuit of success. Yet, success had not come without sacrifice. His fingers brushed against the journal's worn spine, tracing the initials embossed in gold. N.W. the same initials that once adorned the side of a modest storefront, back when his dreams had been simple, back when his wife still loved him, and back when his son still called him Dad, without the weight of resentment. He had written in this journal religiously, each page a ledger not of profits and losses, but of wisdom. Wisdom paid for in sleepless nights and estranged relationships. And now, it was time to pass it on. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. He already knew who it was before the door creaked open. His grandson Daniel stood at the threshold, a hesitant curiosity in his young eyes. 18, and brimming with reckless energy, Daniel was everything Nicholas once was, driven, eager, yet painfully naive. "Grandpa?" Daniel's voice carried both curiosity and uncertainty. He had spent summers here as a child, running through these halls, oblivious to the weight that rested on the man who built them. But things were different now. This visit wasn't about childhood nostalgia, it was about something far more pressing. Nicholas motioned toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Daniel obeyed, his gaze flitting between his grandfather and the journal on the desk. He had grown accustomed to seeing Nicholas in a position of power, but tonight, the old man looked weary. Not weak, not broken, but carrying an exhaustion deeper than the lines etched across his face. "You're leaving for college soon," Nicholas said, his voice even, controlled. "And before you step into the world, I need to give you something." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Money?" A bitter chuckle escaped Nicholas. "Number something far more valuable." He slid the journal toward Daniel, who hesitated before picking it up. The pages smelled of aged paper and ink, of a lifetime spent conquering and losing in equal measure. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice uncertain. Nicholas leaned forward, eyes dark with unspoken memories. "The price of everything I've built, and everything I lost along the way." Daniel ran his fingers over the journal's weathered pages, flipping through handwritten notes filled with calculations, insights, and reflections. He saw sketches of blueprints, scribbled reminders, and paragraphs underlined with ink smudged by time. The weight of the book felt heavier now, as if it contained more than just words. It held a legacy. Nicholas exhaled deeply. "Every mistake, every success, every moment I wished I could change. It's all in there. I won't be around forever, Daniel, and you need to understand what this world will demand of you." Daniel swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "Why me? Why now?" His grandfather's eyes softened, the steel in them giving way to something more vulnerable. "Because I see the fire in you, the same fire I had. But fire without direction is destruction. If you learn from my failures, perhaps you can build something even greater, without losing the things that truly matter." The clock on the mantel chimed, breaking the silence. Daniel clutched the journal to his chest, realization dawning upon him. This wasn't just advice. It was a warning, a lifeline, and a final attempt to steer him away from the same lonely fate that had crept upon his grandfather. "Read it," Nicholas said. "It's just about what you gain. It's about what you're willing to keep." Voice barely above a whisper. "And remember, success is never." The leather-bound journal sat on the polished oak desk, its corners frayed with time. A relic of decades past, its pages bore the weight of every hard-earned lesson, every sleepless night, every triumph and regret. Nicholas Whitmore, a man whose name echoed through boardrooms and financial empires, stared at it with a gaze heavy with contemplation. He had built an empire from the ground up, transforming his father's failing textile business into a multinational conglomerate. But at what cost? The dim glow of the fireplace flickered against the room's mahogany walls, casting elongated shadows that danced across the antique furniture. The storm outside howled like a restless ghost, rattling the grand windows of his estate, yet Nicholas remained unmoved. The storm within him was far worse. He was 60 now, 60 years of calculated risks, relentless ambition, and an unforgiving pursuit of success. Yet, success had not come without sacrifice. His fingers brushed against the journal's worn spine, tracing the initials embossed in gold. NDW. The same initials that once adorned the side of a modest storefront, back when his dreams had been simple, back when his wife still loved him, and back when his son still called him Dad without the weight of resentment. He had written in this journal religiously, each page a ledger not of profits and losses, but of wisdom, wisdom paid for in sleepless nights and estranged relationships. And now, it was time to pass it on. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. He already knew who it was before the door creaked open. His grandson, Daniel, stood at the threshold, a hesitant curiosity in his young eyes. 18 and brimming with reckless energy, Daniel was everything Nicholas once was, driven, eager, yet painfully naive. "Grandpa?" Daniel's voice carried both curiosity and uncertainty. He had spent summers here as a child, running through these halls, oblivious to the weight that rested on the man who built them. But things were different now. This visit wasn't about childhood nostalgia, it was about something far more pressing. Nicholas motioned toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Daniel obeyed, his gaze flitting between his grandfather and the journal on the desk. He had grown accustomed to seeing Nicholas in a position of power, but tonight the old man looked weary. Not weak, not broken, but carrying an exhaustion deeper than the lines etched across his face. "You're leaving for college soon," Nicholas said, his voice even, controlled. "And before you step into the world, I need to give you something." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Money?" A bitter chuckle escaped Nicholas. "Number something far more valuable." He slid the journal toward Daniel, who hesitated before picking it up. The pages smelled of aged paper and ink, of a lifetime spent conquering and losing in equal measure. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice uncertain. Nicholas leaned forward, eyes dark with unspoken memories. "The price of everything I've built, and everything I lost along the way." Daniel ran his fingers over the journal's weathered pages, flipping through handwritten notes filled with calculations, insights, and reflections. He saw sketches of blueprints, scribbled reminders, and paragraphs underlined with ink smudged by time. The weight of the book felt heavier now, as if it contained more than just words. It held a legacy. Nicholas exhaled deeply. "Every mistake, every success, every moment I wished I could change, it's all in there. I won't be around forever, Daniel. And you need to understand what this world will demand of you." Daniel swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "Why me? Why now?" His grandfather's eyes softened, the steel in them giving way to something more vulnerable. "Because I see the fire in you, the same fire I had. But fire without direction is destruction. If you learn from my failures, perhaps you can build something even greater, without losing the things that truly matter." The clock on the mantel chimed, breaking the silence. Daniel clutched the journal to his chest, realization dawning upon him. This wasn't just advice. It was a warning, a lifeline, and a final attempt to steer him away from the same lonely fate that had crept upon his grandfather. "Read it," Nicholas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And remember, success is never just about what you gain. It's about what you're willing to keep." Daniel nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the journal. A solemn understanding passed between them. Nicholas leaned back, exhaling as if shedding a weight from his shoulders. The fire crackled, casting warm, shifting light across their faces. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something had changed. The echoes of past mistakes met the flicker of a new beginning, and in that moment a bridge was built, one forged from the past, guiding the future. The following days passed in a blur. Daniel buried himself in the pages of the journal, uncovering Nicholas's earliest struggles, his biggest gambles, and the betrayals that shaped him. Each entry read like a confession, peeling back the layers of a man Daniel thought he had understood. One passage struck him deeply. March 17, 1983. "Today I made my first million, but I also lost my best friend. I had to choose, Partnership or power? I chose wrong. Daniel looked up from the journal, his mind racing. What had his grandfather done? What price had he paid for his empire? He needed to know more. That night, Daniel found Nicholas in his study, staring into the fire. "Grandpa," he began, voice steady, "tell me about March 17th, 1983. Nicholas closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask so soon. But if you want to understand, you need the full truth." He motioned for Daniel to sit. "Let me tell you about the day I learned that wealth and loyalty don't always coexist." Nicholas leaned back, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "My best friend Thomas and I built this company from nothing. We were two ambitious dreamers, working late nights, risking everything. But when the money started flowing, greed took root. There was a deal. Our biggest yet. But Thomas wanted to take a safer route, to protect what we had. I wanted more." Nicholas's voice dropped, filled with old regret. "I forced his hand, took the deal without him. It made me rich overnight, but it destroyed our friendship. He walked away, never spoke to me again. And in that moment I realized that success without trust is just an illusion." Daniel absorbed his grandfather's words, the weight of the story settling over him. "So what do I do? How do I avoid making the same mistake?" Nicholas sighed. "You'll face choices, Daniel. Some will test your morals, others your loyalty. Read my journal, but make your own decisions. Just remember, wealth is meaningless if you stand alone at the top." Daniel stared at the fire, the flames reflecting his own inner turmoil. The rising action had begun. His path was set, but the choices ahead would define him forever. Daniel sat in the dim glow of his bedroom, the leather-bound journal resting heavily in his hands. He had read its pages obsessively over the past week, but tonight, something new caught his eye. A folded letter wedged between the final entries. His breath hitched as he unfolded it, his grandfather's familiar handwriting scrawled across the paper. "To my son, by the time you read this, I will either be gone or too old for words to change what has already been done. But there are things I have kept from you, mistakes I swore I would never let define me. And yet, they did. I wish I had the courage to tell you in person, but I failed as a father long before you had a chance to understand why. This is my confession, my reckoning, and the truth you deserve, even if it comes far too late." Daniel's fingers trembled as he turned the page, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. His father had never spoken much about Nicholas, always referring to him with the cold detachment of a man severed from his past. Daniel had assumed it was resentment over work, over being neglected. But now, the weight of something much deeper, much darker, pressed down on him. Nicholas had never intended for Daniel to see this letter. It was meant for his father, Daniel's father. But why had it never reached him? What was so damning that it had to remain hidden? His eyes darted across the page, devouring every word. March 17th, 1983. That date again. The same one Nicholas had spoken of. The day he had made his first million. The day he had lost his best friend. But this letter suggested there was more. Something far worse than betrayal. Daniel read on. "I let greed consume me. Thomas wasn't just my best friend. He was your godfather. He was family in every way that mattered. And I destroyed him. Not just his career, not just his dreams. I took away everything. And the worst part? I did it knowing what it would cost him." Daniel's chest tightened, his hands curled into fists. Nicholas had spoken of his regrets, of sacrifices, but he had never revealed this. He had framed it as a business decision, a painful but necessary choice. But the words before him painted a different picture, one of deliberate, ruthless ambition. He felt sick. Thomas had a wife, a son. They trusted me, relied on me. And when I took the deal without him, I didn't just sever a friendship. I condemned them to ruin. They lost their home, their security. And Thomas, he didn't survive it. The pressure, the shame, it broke him. He took his own life 2 months later. The air left Daniel's lungs. Your mother wanted me to tell you the truth. She wanted you to know the kind of man I really was. But I couldn't bear it. I lied, and I kept lying, convincing myself it was for your own good. But it wasn't. It was for me. To live with myself. To pretend I hadn't done something unforgivable. Daniel felt like the walls around him were closing in. He had idolized Nicholas, respected his wisdom despite the harshness. But now he saw the man for what he truly was, a destroyer, a coward. The journal slipped from his hands, crashing to the floor. His vision blurred as the words burned into his mind, searing into the very foundation of his beliefs. Nicholas had built his empire not on strategy or resilience, but on the ashes of a man who had trusted him. His grandfather had lied, to his father, to the world, and now, to him. A sudden, uncontrollable rage surged through him. He stormed out of the room, the letter clenched in his fist, his pulse hammering against his skull. The hallways of the estate felt suffocating, each portrait of Nicholas staring down at him with ghostly judgment. The fire in the study was still crackling when he barged in, his grandfather sitting in his usual chair, swirling a glass of whiskey as if nothing in the world could touch him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel's voice was raw, shaking. Nicholas barely looked up, his expression unreadable. "Tell you what." Daniel slammed the letter onto the desk. "Don't play games with me." For the first time, something flickered in Nicholas's eyes. Recognition. Guilt. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. "You weren't supposed to see that," Nicholas muttered, reaching for the letter, but Daniel snatched it away. "No," Daniel snapped. "You don't get to bury this. You don't get to pretend you're just a wise old man passing down knowledge. You ruined a man's life and you hid it." Nicholas sighed, setting his drink down. "I did what I had to do." "You killed him." The words tasted like acid on Daniel's tongue. "You didn't pull the trigger, but you may as well have." Nicholas's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone, boy." "Or what?" Daniel spat. "You'll destroy me too?" A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Nicholas looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time in Daniel's life his grandfather seemed old, small. A man weighed down by ghosts of his own making. "I never wanted this life for you," Nicholas murmured. "Then why did you bring me here? Why give me the journal?" Nicholas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Because I thought, maybe if you knew, you'd make different choices." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "You don't want me to be better. You want me to fix your conscience, to undo what you did." Nicholas didn't argue. He simply stared into the fire, as if hoping it would burn away the sins of his past. Daniel clenched his fists, his mind spiraling. He had spent his life trying to live up to the Whitmore name. But now? Now he wanted nothing to do with it. "I'm leaving," he said. Nicholas stiffened. "Daniel? I won't be you." His voice was steel now, unwavering. "I won't build my life on the suffering of others." Nicholas's expression darkened. "And what will you do? Walk away from everything?" "Yes." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Nicholas watched him, and for the first time, his eyes softened, not with arrogance, not with control, but with something dangerously close to sadness. "I suppose you are better than me," Nicholas murmured. Daniel turned away, his chest heaving. "I'm not better. I'm just not a coward." And with that, he left the room, the door slamming behind him. For the first time in 60 years, Nicholas Whitmore sat alone in his grand estate, surrounded by everything he had built. And for the first time, it all felt utterly meaningless. Daniel had seen the truth, and the truth had shattered everything. The night air was sharp, slicing through Daniel's coat as he walked aimlessly through the streets. His breath fogged in front of him, but he hardly noticed the cold. His mind was a battlefield, thoughts clashing with emotions too raw to contain. The estate, his grandfather's imposing legacy, loomed behind him like a mausoleum, filled with ghosts of ambition, betrayal, and regret. He had walked away from it, walked away from everything he thought he knew, and now he was nowhere. His feet carried him through an unfamiliar part of town where flickering streetlights cast long, wavering shadows on cracked sidewalks. The contrast was staggering. No polished marble floors, no mahogany desks, no power-hungry men in tailored suits whispering behind cigar smoke. Just worn-down buildings, empty streets, and the distant hum of a city that never truly slept. He had spent years idolizing his grandfather, believing Nicholas was a man of wisdom and resilience. But now, that image had shattered. Nicholas Whitmore was no mentor, no guiding hand. He was a man who had built his empire on the suffering of others and justified it as the price of success. And Daniel had been set up to follow in those same footsteps. The weight of it was suffocating. He came to a stop in front of a small, run-down cafe, its neon sign buzzing weakly against the silence of the night. Through the window, a lone woman sat at the counter, stirring a cup of coffee with slow, deliberate movements. Something about her stillness, her quiet contemplation called to him. Maybe it was because she looked just as lost as he felt. Before he knew why, he pushed open the door. A bell chimed softly overhead. The warmth inside was immediate, wrapping around him like an old blanket. The woman looked up, her tired eyes meeting his. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice steady but kind. Daniel hesitated before nodding. "You could say that." She gestured to the stool beside her. "Sit, you look like you could use something warm." He slid onto the seat, and the woman waved at the man behind the counter. Without a word, he poured a fresh cup of coffee and set it in front of Daniel. "On the house," the woman said. Daniel wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. He stared into the dark liquid, the steam rising in delicate wisps. He could feel the woman watching him, studying him without prying. "You remind me of someone I used to know," she finally said. Daniel glanced up. "Yeah?" She nodded. "A man who thought he had all the answers, until life showed him he didn't." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sounds familiar." The woman tilted her head slightly, something understanding in her gaze. "Let me give you some advice, kid. The past doesn't define you, but how you face it does." Daniel exhaled slowly, gripping the mug tighter. "And what if the past is all you have? Then you decide what part of it you carry forward," she said simply. For the first time that night, something settled inside him. Not peace, he was far from that, but an understanding that the choices ahead were his. Nicholas had made his choices, and they had left him powerful but alone. Daniel still had time. He still had a chance to be different. The two sat in silence, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the empty spaces between them. Daniel took a sip of the coffee, its bitterness grounding him. He wasn't ready to forgive Nicholas. He wasn't even sure he was ready to move forward. But maybe, just maybe, he could start figuring out what forward even looked like. Outside, the storm had begun to settle, and within Daniel, something had shifted, a fragile flickering hope, barely more than an ember. But sometimes an ember was all it took to start a fire. The morning light was gray and dull, filtering weakly through the cafe windows. Daniel hadn't slept. He had sat at the counter for hours, staring into his empty coffee cup, replaying everything in his mind, his grandfather's lies, the betrayal, the weight of an empire built on broken trust, and the choice he now had to make. He knew he couldn't stay in limbo forever. Walking away from Nicholas had felt right in the moment, but the truth still sat heavy in his chest. He couldn't ignore it. He needed closure. He needed answers. By the time he stepped back into the estate, the air inside felt colder than he remembered. The grand halls, once symbols of power, now felt suffocating. Nicholas was waiting in his study, sitting in the same leather chair, a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up when Daniel entered, eyes unreadable. "You came back." His voice was level, but there was something behind it, something almost wary. Daniel swallowed the anger bubbling inside him. I need to know why. Nicholas set his glass down with a quiet clink. Why what? Why you wrote that letter to my father? Why you never gave it to him? A shadow flickered across Nicholas's face. He exhaled slowly, standing and walking toward the fireplace. Because I was a coward. The confession startled Daniel. He had expected another justification, another speech about power and success. But instead, his grandfather stood there, staring into the flames, looking smaller than he ever had. I wrote that letter the day I realized I had lost him, Nicholas continued. The day I understood that there are some mistakes you can't undo. I thought that if I could explain myself, maybe he wouldn't hate me. Daniel clenched his jaw. But you never gave it to him. Nicholas turned, his gaze hardening. Because I knew it wouldn't change anything. I knew that no amount of words could erase what I did. Silence stretched between them. Daniel's hands curled into fists. And what about me? What was I supposed to do with all this? Just follow in your footsteps? Nicholas studied him for a long moment. I wanted you to learn from my mistakes. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. You didn't want me to learn. You wanted me to fix them. Nicholas flinched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Daniel caught it. For the first time in his life, he saw his grandfather not as an untouchable figure of power, but as a man, one who had made choices and now had to live with them. But that didn't mean Daniel had to. He stepped forward. I'm done living under your shadow. Nicholas's expression darkened. And what will you do? Walk away? Throw everything I built in the trash? Yes. The certainty in his voice sent a crack through the tension in the room. Nicholas's grip tightened on the glass, his knuckles white. You're making a mistake. No, Daniel said, voice steady. I'm finally making my choice. Nicholas stared at him, and for a moment, Daniel thought he might try to stop him. But then slowly, something in his grandfather's face shifted. Resignation. You really are different from me, Nicholas murmured. Daniel exhaled, his heart pounding. I hope so. And then he turned and walked out of the study, leaving the past behind him. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. Daniel packed his things, preparing to leave the estate for good. His mind was clear, his heart lighter than it had been in years. But on his final night, a knock at his door shattered the quiet. Nicholas stood in the doorway, looking older than Daniel had ever seen him. He held something in his hands, a small tattered envelope. I should have given this to your father, he said, but I want you to have it. Daniel hesitated before taking it. His grandfather didn't say another word. He just nodded once, then walked away. Alone, Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was another letter, written in the same slanted handwriting. Daniel, if you're reading this, then maybe, just maybe, I finally found the courage to do something right. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect understanding. But I need you to know that everything I built, it was never worth losing the people I loved. Don't make my mistakes. Build something better. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. For all his flaws, Nicholas had finally told the truth. And that was enough. With the first rays of dawn stretching across the horizon, Daniel walked out of the estate, his own man, finally free. The estate was silent when Daniel walked out for the last time. The weight of generations of ambition, betrayal, and sacrifice sat behind him, but he didn't look back. The morning air was crisp, the sky painted in the soft hues of dawn. It felt symbolic, a new beginning, untouched by his grandfather's mistakes. He hadn't expected to feel relief. He had thought walking away from an empire, from power, would be painful. But as he stepped onto the gravel driveway, a strange lightness settled in his chest. For the first time in his life, he wasn't carrying someone else's expectations. He wasn't bound by the past. A taxi waited at the end of the long driveway. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror as Daniel slid into the back seat. Airport? the man asked. Daniel hesitated, gripping his duffel bag. Number just, drive. I'll tell you where to go. The car rolled forward, leaving the estate behind. For hours, Daniel wandered the city. The towering skyline, the rush of morning commuters, the scent of fresh bread from street vendors, it all felt different now. As if the world had expanded beyond the walls of his grandfather's mansion. Eventually, he found himself at a familiar cafe, the same place where just nights ago, a stranger had given him the words he hadn't realized he needed. The woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow as he walked in. You again. Daniel managed a small smile. Yeah. Guess I wasn't done figuring things out. She poured him a coffee without asking. And? Got it all sorted now? He exhaled, staring into the dark liquid. Not even close. She smirked. Good. Means you're still human. He sipped his coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. He had no idea what came next. No idea what he would do, where he would go. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't terrify him. It excited him. Nicholas had spent his life chasing security, power, control. And in doing so, he had lost everything. Daniel wouldn't make the same mistake. A week later, Daniel found himself standing outside an old brick building in the heart of the city. A small startup firm, nothing glamorous, nothing with the Whitmore name attached. He had called in a favor, reached out to an old college friend who had been trying to get a tech company off the ground. It wasn't much, just a desk and a laptop in a co-working space, but it was his choice. When he walked in, his friend grinned. Didn't think you'd actually show. Daniel shrugged, setting his bag down. Guess I need to prove to myself that I can do something without my grandfather's money. His friend chuckled. Well, welcome to the world of startups. Hope you like cheap coffee and no sleep. Daniel smiled. For the first time in what felt like years, it was real. Back at the Whitmore estate, Nicholas sat alone in his study. The house was quieter than it had ever been. His grandson was gone, his empire standing. But suddenly it all felt meaningless. The fire crackled beside him, but it didn't bring warmth. He stared at the letter he had given Daniel, wondering if the boy would ever forgive him. Maybe he didn't deserve forgiveness. Maybe Daniel was better off leaving the Whitmore name behind? Nicholas closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he wondered if power had ever been worth it. The sun hung low in the sky as Daniel stood on the rooftop of the co-working space, the city stretching endlessly before him. The skyline wasn't just a backdrop now, it was a world of opportunities, paths he could choose for himself. No more expectations, no more shadows of the past dictating his future. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air settle in his lungs. He had spent weeks working at the startup, learning the grind of building something from the ground up. The money wasn't much, the hours were long, but it felt right. It felt real. This was what Nicholas had never understood, the value of struggle, of earning something without crushing others beneath you. He thought back to the estate, the suffocating halls of wealth and legacy. It had once seemed so permanent, so inescapable. But now he could barely remember why he had ever wanted it. A gust of wind ruffled his shirt. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, allowing himself a rare moment of stillness. He had spent so much time running, from expectations, from the truth, from his own doubts. But now he just stood, unburdened, grounded. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Hello? A familiar voice, rough with age but softer than he had ever heard it before. Daniel. Nicholas. Daniel stiffened, gripping the edge of the railing. He hadn't expected to hear from him again. He had assumed their last conversation in the estate had been final, that Nicholas would let him go. But here he was, breaking the silence. How did you get this number? Daniel asked, his voice devoid of the warmth it once held for his grandfather. A low chuckle. You forget who I am? Daniel said nothing. He could hear the faint clink of glass, the subtle rasp of Nicholas clearing his throat. The weight of years hung in that pause, a man who had spent a lifetime holding power now sounding tired. "I'm not calling to drag you back," Nicholas continued, as if reading his thoughts. I wanted to hear your voice." Daniel closed his eyes. There was no command in his grandfather's tone, no arrogance, just an old man who had finally, maybe, begun to understand what he had lost. "I'm doing fine," Daniel finally said, "figuring things out." A pause. "Good. You should." The silence between them wasn't filled with expectation. It wasn't Nicholas waiting for Daniel to cave, to admit he had been wrong. It was something else. Regret. Maybe even the beginnings of acceptance. Daniel swallowed, debating whether to end the call. He didn't owe Nicholas anything, not anymore. But some small part of him, the boy who had once looked up to his grandfather, still wanted to believe there was something salvageable. "I read the letter," Daniel admitted. Nicholas exhaled. And I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything," Nicholas said. "Just don't let my mistakes become yours." Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't as heavy as before. For years, Daniel had chased his grandfather's approval. He had wanted to prove he was worthy of carrying the Whitmore name. But standing here now, high above the city, with no wealth to his name and no title hanging over him, he realized something. He didn't need Nicholas's validation. He never had. "I don't hate you," Daniel said suddenly. The word surprised even him. Nicholas made a sound, soft, unreadable. "I know," Daniel sighed, "but I can't be you." "I know that too." Daniel glanced out at the skyline, the last rays of sunlight stretching across the horizon. He had spent his whole life inside Nicholas's world. Now, he was stepping into his own. "Goodbye, Grandpa," Daniel said. Nicholas hesitated, then softly replied, "Goodbye, Daniel." The call ended. Daniel let out a breath, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had envisioned anger, shouting, blame. But there was none of that. Just an ending and a beginning. Nicholas would go on as he always had. And Daniel? Daniel would build something new. A week later, Daniel stood in front of a modest apartment complex in the city. It wasn't much, just a tiny place above a bookstore. But it was his. No family crest on the gate, no looming portraits of ancestors staring down at him. Just a blank slate. He unlocked the door, stepping inside. The space was small, the furniture second-hand, but it was warm. It felt lived in. It felt right. He dropped his duffel bag onto the couch and pulled out a single item, the leather-bound journal. Nicholas's words were still inside, still imprinted in ink, but they didn't control him anymore. He flipped to the last page. His own handwriting stared back at him, a note he had written just before leaving the estate. "My name is Daniel Whitmore, but I don't have to be." He closed the journal, setting it on a shelf. It was part of his past, and that was okay. But it wouldn't define his future. Outside, the city pulsed with life, the sounds of distant laughter, honking taxis, the hum of possibility. For the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't trapped in someone else's story. This one was his to write. And he was ready. That night, Daniel stepped onto his tiny balcony, looking up at the vast sky above. The city lights shimmered below, and for the first time in years, he felt light. Nicholas had always lived under the weight of his past. But Daniel? He was letting it go. A shooting star streaked across the sky. He smiled. Maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. Daniel's journey wasn't just about rejecting his grandfather's legacy. It was about choosing his own path, even when it meant walking into the unknown. What about you? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between expectation and self-discovery? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters. If this journey resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more powerful stories like this. Because in the end, success isn't about what you inherit. It's about what you create. Now tell me, what will you choose?